For Creamer Media's Policy, I'm Sashni Mudley. Jonathan Answer joins me today to discuss his book, Spy, Uncovering Craig Williamson. For a number of years in the 1970s, Craig Williamson was a very effective spy for the apartheid government. What made you decide to write about his life?
There were a number of reasons. Firstly, I was at WITS in the early 1990s and I joined NUSAS, and although at that time it was the end of apartheid, there was still a sense that there were spies on campus, and I got quite intrigued about what it meant for somebody to infiltrate an organization and then lead this double life. I wanted to know what it took for a person to actually do that. And then in 1995, I went and studied at Rhodes University, and I got quite intrigued by Ruth First as a journalist. She was a brave journalist who did a lot of things that and went in those times where journalists didn't go. And I was quite intrigued by her life. And then it was that year that I discovered that Craig Williamson had been responsible for her death. And the death of Maurice Schoen's wife, Jeannette Schoen, and their daughter, 6-year-old Katrine Schoen. So it was all these different reasons. And then in 2010, I was in the car. I just arrived in Durban for a workshop that I was giving, and I was with a young journalist. And we turned onto the Ruth First freeway. And I turned to the journalist and I said, it just suddenly struck me, what does Craig Williamson think when he turns onto this freeway? And I said, I wondered what Craig Williamson thinks. And the person turned to me and said, well, who's Craig Williamson? And then I thought, we need to remember our history. We need to record what has happened, otherwise we'll forget it. And I had followed, the Truth Commission, and I'd followed him getting amnesty, and I felt that he had escaped accountability, and I wanted it in some way to put on record what had happened and what he was responsible for.
As part of your research, you interviewed some of Williamson's former schoolmates. What did his former classmates have to say about him?
Well, they didn't have very good things to say about him. These are memories that are more than 50 years old, but he had an impact even then. And it was quite difficult to track down these people, I think for various reasons, but eventually I tracked down somebody who was in his boarding house. And he remembers Williamson as a bully, somebody who had no real impact at school other than being a bully. And then I went, and these were very similar stories that I heard from people who were at school with him. And then I went to the St. John's archive and I started going through the Old Johannian, which is the magazines from St. John's, which is where Williamson was at school. And there was no trace of him in these archives until I got to 1966. And I had this impression of Williamson just going through school unnoticed. Until 1966, I found this record that talked about an election which coincided with the general election in the country. And Williamson had represented a very far right-wing splinter group called the Republican Party, and he had won this election. And it was a right-wing group in the heart of Helen Suzman's, Liberal Progressive Federal Party constituency, and that seemed to tell a lot. That seemed to be quite instructive of what Williamson was like.
Why and how was Williamson recruited as a spy?
The how is quite easy in that I think he had gone into the police after school. Most people, you had to do, sort of white men had to do compulsory military service, but you could go into the police as an alternative. And he went into the police. And I think they saw him as an English-speaking person who was going to go to WITS, and that he would be quite easy, it would be easy for him to infiltrate the student movement. How they did it, they just approached him and they offered it, they put this to him, and it took him about a minute to say yes. So yes, I think they identified that he was quite clever, quite shrewd, and that he sort of vaguely fitted what they might thought would be a profile of a left-wing English-speaking person. He didn't quite fit that profile, though.
How did he manage to infiltrate the student movement that was engaged in the fight against apartheid?
I think at that time there was a sense of paranoia, so people were suspicious of spies, and there were questions that had been raised because he had been in the police and because he didn't quite fit the mold of a typical lefty. He was big, and he was almost like a rugger-bugger rather than a sort of Marxist spouting lefty. But he managed to infiltrate, because I think at that time nobody knew who was the spy and who wasn't. It was a time of deep paranoia, so there were allegations flying around about who was a spy, and you could never really prove it. So I think some people were cautious and kept him at arm's distance. But also he made himself very valuable in the student movement. He knew about finances, he knew about administration, he knew about organization. And so he was quite an effective person in NUSAS, which was the student movement he infiltrated. NUSAS was virtually bankrupt at that time, and he nursed it back to financial health. And he was quite a solid organizing person. And in the left, there weren't too many of those people who were prepared to get their hands dirty doing that kind of the grunt work. And I think also people gave him the benefit of the doubt. And you know, because he was a plant in the sense that he was there not to kind of, you know, if there had been a meeting and somebody said something, he wouldn't pass this information on to the police for that person to be arrested. He was there to give information for the long term. So there was no consequences of him being there that they could see. The students didn't realize that if they had a meeting and they said something, that the police would be there the next day, so they couldn't pin anything on him. But he was busy giving information about their strategies and how to disrupt what they were doing.
At one point, the security police were actually helping anti-apartheid activists to flee from repression in South Africa. Tell us about this and Williamson's role.
Yes, so this was also very cunning on their part. What they would do is they had a pipeline that they would smuggle people out of South Africa to Botswana. And they did it for a number of reasons. It does sound quite odd. But they would do it because it would build the credibility of Williamson. He was sending people out and helping the kind of the activists get out of the country. The other reason was that they would be indebted to him when they did get out and when they rose up through the ranks. And then another reason was that they were going to get out of the country anyway, and arresting them on the border would have just meant 6 months in prison. That was what, you know, for escaping the country. That was the penalty. But now it enabled the security branch to know who was getting out of the country and where they were going. So it was quite a cunning plan. And then eventually Williamson used his own pipeline to get himself and Eric Abram out of the country. Eric Abram was a NUSAS activist. He was quite on the fringes of NUSAS, but he was a student activist who had then started a news agency that was anti-apartheid. And Williamson needed to get out of the country and to make a little bit of a song and dance about it. So he, through a very calculated and manipulative way, managed to convince Eric Abram to leave with him. So they walked into Botswana, and Eric Abram had some profile and was able to hold a press conference to talk about how he had escaped the security branch. And this helped build Williamson's credibility as well. So it was quite a cunning plan from the security branch.
Can you give a sense of how far Williamson managed to get in penetrating the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and beyond the country's borders?
So when he left and when he got out of the country, he landed a job with an organization called the IUEF, which is the International University Exchange Fund. And this was an organization that helped fund anti-apartheid organizations. So he placed himself with the money. So he was dishing out money, which was very useful as somebody who was dealing with information, because he was trading money for information. And it placed him at the center of a lot of what was going on in the country, in the anti-apartheid movements. It also, people wanted money. They needed money to operate. And so they turned to him, and he would be able to have an idea of who was doing what in the left wing. So it was quite a strategically brilliant place for him to be. And then he used that to try and get into the ANC at quite a high level. It's not clear exactly how far he got into the ANC. He did at some point start his own cell within the ANC, but it was a cell of enemy agents. It was a cell of himself, somebody called Carl Edwards, who was working for Boss, and another apartheid agent. And they got two Ronnie Casrolls, and Ronnie Casrolls was not convinced of them, and he gave them a number of tests which didn't really prove either way if he was a spy or not. And I think what he did do, what there is no doubt, is that he managed to sow mistrust and confusion and to manipulate events. I'm not convinced he got into the heart of the ANC as he claims, and as it was claimed when he returned to South Africa. But he did, the ANC was quite a fragmented organization, and he was able to manipulate factions within the ANC, also, cause ructions between the ANC and the Black Consciousness Movement, and also the Pan-Africanist Congress. So he played a very divisive role.
What was Williamson's suspected involvement in Steve Biko's murder? What
he has said is that when Steve Biko had come to the Western Cape, and there was talks about Biko being smuggled out of the country to go and meet with Oliver Tambo, and for the ANC and the Black Consciousness Movement to try and find some common ground. He had found out about this meeting that was taking place, and the suspicion is that he had alerted the authorities to the fact that Biko was in the Western Cape and was on his way back to the Eastern Cape when he was found at a roadblock. So it's not really clear whether that led to them capturing Steve Biko, but he certainly passed on information about the meetings between Oliver Tambo and Steve Biko, and the IUF was one of the organizations that was trying to set up this meeting. So there are question marks about his involvement in Biko's death.
There are many lesser-known struggle figures, one of them being Jenny Curtis, also known as Jeannette Schoen, after she got married. Tell us about her role in the struggle, and her fate at the hands of Craig Williamson.
So one of the reasons that I wrote this book was to kind of bring her into the public domain more. I think it is one, as you say, I think it is one of the untold stories. Not that it's untold, but I think she has been forgotten largely. A lot of people have been forgotten for their roles. And while Williamson was responsible for the death of Ruth First, he was also responsible for the death of Jenny Curtis and her daughter Katrine. The Curtis family is in fact a very interesting family in the South African liberation struggle. Jack Curtis and his wife Joyce Curtis were very involved in politics, in progressive politics in I'd imagine it was about the 50s and 60s. And Jeannette and her older brother Neville were very involved in NewSAS. I think Neville was the president and Jeannette was the vice president. And so they were involved as student leaders. And then Jeannette became quite involved in the trade union movement and was responsible for helping to set up the trade union movement in South Africa. And she was, Neville was hounded by the police. He was banned. She was also detained and eventually banned. And Neville eventually escaped, and he went off to Australia, and he went to Tasmania eventually. Jeannette was then banned, and it was at this time that she met Marius Schoen, who had come out of prison for planting a bomb at a police station. And the two of them got together and got involved, and they got married, but they were both banned people. So their actual marriage was, at that time, two banned people couldn't be together. So their marriage, the actual wedding ceremony, was illegal. And they then also smuggled themselves out of the country, where they went into Botswana, and they continued to work for the ANC. She was also involved in the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. And when they were in Botswana, they had two children, Katrine and Fritz. And after a couple of years of them, they were still involved in propaganda work for the ANC and research. They got information that their lives were in danger, and the advice from the ANC was to go to Angola. And they did go to Angola, and they went to the university, and it was on one of these days that a parcel bomb was sent, and Marius had stayed behind, or he had gone to the capital, and Jeannette opened the bomb, and it killed her and her daughter. Fritz was there, but miraculously wasn't killed. He was 2.5 at the time, but he witnessed his mother and his sister being blown to bits. And I think that for me was really, really hard. You can kind of justify in your own mind, Williamson can justify in his own mind about killing people who are kind of waging war against him. But a 6-year-old is not waging war against anybody. And I think that for me was something that really made me sit up and kind of take notice, the killing of Jeannette Schoen, who today would have been playing a very positive role in South Africa, I'm sure of.
What were Williamson's feelings towards what he called moderate, non-revolutionary blacks?
Yes. So, this was at the time, after he was eventually unmasked as a spy in 1980, that was when he got involved in the dirtier aspects of the war, with sending parcel bombs. And in 1985, he wrote a piece for Leadership magazine, which was a think tank, about the country's reform process. And it was clear that what was happening is that they were looking for people to negotiate with. And they had identified the ANC as revolutionary blacks. And he wrote about moderate, non-revolutionary blacks. And it was essentially, they were trying to kind of form an alliance or go into a political partnership, as they had done with the tricameral parliament. They were trying to do this and identify an alternative to the ANC. And this is what he referred to in this think tank piece as, moderate, non-revolutionary blacks.
Can you explain when and how Williamson's cover was blown and his role as spy for the apartheid state was revealed?
Okay, so it was blown in January 1980. There are a number of theories about why he was eventually unmasked, but I think probably the most accurate one was that just before then, a boss agent that happened to be on the SRC when Williamson was on the SRC defected to Britain. And what had happened was the boss discovered that this agent was living with a man, and in apartheid South Africa, I'm not sure which was worse, being gay or being a communist. So they were about to detain him, and they told him that he must report. This man's name is Arthur McGiven, and they told him that he must report to boss headquarters the following day. So that night he went to boss headquarters with a suitcase, and he just took a whole lot of documents, and he fled the country. And then when news that he had defected kind of reached Williamson was quite nervous that McGiven would expose him. So they hatched a plan, him and his handler, Johan Coetzee, who went on to becoming the police commissioner, to try and blackmail the head of the IUF, the director. Williamson at this point had become the deputy director of the IUF, so a very influential position. And so they tried, so Coetzee flew to Switzerland and they tried to blackmail Lars Gunnar Eriksson, who was the director. And to his credit, he refused to be blackmailed. And eventually, and that is how Williamson was exposed.
What was Williamson's demeanor during the TRC, and did he take responsibility for his crimes?
I don't think he did. I think that he came there not to tell the story, not to confess, but because it was a way out of his legal problems. And he said so much, he said as much before he went to the TRC. So I think he was there to try to justify what he did, and his justification was, this was a war, I was on the one side of the war, I was a patriot protecting the country from the communists. So I don't believe that he went to the TRC to divulge the whole truth, and I think he was quite smug and arrogant. And the photograph on the front cover of the book is taken from the TRC, and I think that speaks quite a lot about his attitude.
During your research for this book, you were able to meet Craig Williamson in person. What was your impression of him?
Yes, he was the very last person that I interviewed. So I had done all this research, I'd spoken to a whole lot of people, I'd got to know him through archives and through the eyes of the people that he had betrayed. So I had an impression of him and I knew his story well. So the meeting with him was, I just wanted to get a sense of him, and I wanted to sort of look him in the eye and just see whether he had remorse. My impression of him was of somebody who doesn't have remorse, who sticks to the script, and he has, I mean, in his, whatever you say about him, he's been consistent about his story. Throughout the years, he believes that what he did was right. And I wasn't going to change him. I wasn't there to argue with him, but nobody was going to change his mind. And I did ask him what it was like, what he felt when he turned onto the Ruth First Freeway. Yeah.
What was his answer?
He just went bright red, and then he said that Ruth First and Marius Schoen and Jeannette Schoen, they knew the risks involved. So he didn't really answer the question, but he said, they knew the risks involved. They were part of the ANC, and he was just doing his job. But he did go bright red.
What sort of life does Craig Williamson lead today?
Well, he leads. He's kind of slipped into, under the radar, and he's, I kind of stalked him a bit on social media, and I tried to, pry into his Facebook life, and from what I can gather, he lives a life free of consequences. So he's he's a retired. He's still involved in a tobacco company where he brings tobacco in from Botswana into South Africa, and he's got a granddaughter that he's a doting grandfather, and he's got 3 children, and he lives a life without consequences in a very wealthy suburb of Johannesburg, and enjoys the good life.
What do you think of the super spy label, which some say applied to Williamson? Does it not serve to lend some credibility to conduct that was in fact reprehensible?
Look, I mean, he was undercover for 8 years, so he must have been a good spy in that he wasn't uncovered. I don't think he did the things that he, I don't think he was as effective. When he came back, he was kind of big upped as the super spy who had infiltrated the KGB, and and he boasted about how how close he got into the heart of the ANC, and he wrote a piece for the Police magazine which basically made it sound as if he controlled the ANC. In fact, he went to Moscow, but as a tourist, so there was he got nowhere near that sort of level of being an undercover agent. I think he was effective in that he sowed distrust amongst the ANC comrades and the NUSAS comrades. He was effective. Whether he was a super spy, he was probably South Africa's most effective spy. I don't think he did, anything near as he claimed to have done, but he was effective. He left a trail of destruction in his wake. So yes, I'm not sure, does it lend credibility to him? I don't think he's seen as credible. He's seen as a killer, I think, which is what he is.
That was Jonathan Answer discussing his book Spy, Uncovering Craig Williamson.